For many years now, I have been saying that even the American democratic system will ultimately fail, that it will never become the kingdom of God, that democracy itself must be shown to be inferior to whatever God's government ultimately will look like. Is that defeatist? Hi, I'm Brandon, and I'd like to welcome you to the Crucible of Thought podcast. For the last few years, I've been rethinking a lot of my spiritual and political stances, and this podcast is where I explore the various topics and their impact on the church and the nation. This is episode number 138, and the title of this episode is On the Death of American Democracy. At the time I said those things, I was saying them as a conservative evangelical Christian, and they came with a lot of assumptions. For example, at the time I believed that the only truly righteous form of government would be a patriarchal family, that it was necessary to see a structure where righteous men ruled righteously over their subordinates, and that the rule flowed down from God through the patriarchs to their clans and tribes and families. Essentially a giant pyramid of authority, with all the ranking that implies. These days, I see things rather differently, that power over others, even authority over others, isn't the goal. It's every individual so perfectly ruled by the Spirit, so individually precisely like God themselves, that nobody needs to have control or authority over another. Or, better stated perhaps, that nobody needs someone else to have control over them to see righteousness flourish in everyone. Yes, current systems definitely involve structures that encode power over and authority over. Yes, the Bible definitely describes power structures. And yes, a truly flat system is almost infinitely distant from where we are today. But when you extrapolate the Bible's teachings, I believe a flat system where nobody is controlling anybody else is the most likely answer to how things should be. It's beyond our capability now, but perhaps not beyond what a truly righteous people can do. So I cannot see how any variation or derivation of America's system of humans leading and directing and controlling and holding authority over other humans can truly be biblical. As such, despite the very significant changes in my theology and my sense that America's systems cannot last forever, hasn't changed. It's just for different reasons. On the one hand, capitalism isn't the right answer, but on the other, patriarchy and its power structures don't seem to be the right answer either. But it's what we have now, and as many politicians have observed over the years, quote, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all others which have been tried. Until the kingdom of God is more visible here on earth, my preference is certainly for democracy over, say, pure socialism or communism or fascism. What we Americans have mostly enjoyed up until this time is actually a liberal democracy, not liberal in the sense of not conservative, but liberal in the sense of limited government that is subject to the will of its citizens, as discussed or defined in Britannica's online dictionary. However, I'm being intensely challenged these days by what I'm watching happen, because I never imagined that in just a few short years we'd see the wholesale abandonment of essential principles of liberal democracy by the very people that taught me to honor and value democracy above all else, the Republican Party and conservative Christians, who for decades howled in anger at anything and everything they perceived as even slightly socialist or communist or anti-democratic. We fought entire world wars against anything else, and hundreds of thousands of Americans died to bring the blessings of democracy and liberty to our neighbors on this planet. And somehow, in just a few years, those supporters of republicanism swung radically, en masse, towards an authoritarian ideal, and to all appearances are utterly infatuated with anyone who proposes to give them power over others, so that their preferred social and religious agenda might take control. I sense that what has changed is that these conservatives finally realize that a democratic form of government absolutely requires compromise. You cannot have your way with the world if you're willing to share power with people who disagree with you. As long as they held the majority position and could fairly regularly have control of two or even all three branches of our governmental systems, they could console themselves that any setbacks were just speed bumps on the way to a conservative utopia. But when faced with a declining share of the racial mix in America and a growing presence of people who didn't think like them and a decline in religious control, something suddenly snapped, and they abruptly decided as a group, in just a few short years, that democracy be damned if it means that they were not going to be in charge. In other words, democracy really only mattered if they were winning with it. Now, plenty of scholarly books point out that this trend is not as new or as sudden as it seemed to be. For example, in Preparing for War, the extremist history of white Christian nationalism and what comes next, Bradley Onishi argues convincingly that this move towards authoritarianism and nationalism has been very deliberately pursued since the 1960s. I've read plenty of American and evangelical history lately, and I must now acknowledge that this push towards social and religious control is not new. However, for those of us who have not been peering behind the curtain, it feels new. It feels like suddenly the rug has been yanked out from underneath those democratic ideals, explicitly by evangelicals. And it's deeply disconcerting. One reason it's disconcerting is that I've also read the history of Germany, and I know well how fast a nation can swing from liberal democracy to absolute dictatorship and complete fascism. And I know well how fast a people can completely lose their freedoms. And 2020's America is following 1930s Germany's history nearly perfectly. It took Hitler 10 years to come back from a failed coup, but once he was back on the scene and elected in democratic elections as the chancellor, it took him less than 1 year to completely seize control and another year to eliminate all rivals and declare himself ruler and dictator. These things happen fast once they begin. And unless we're hyper-vigilant, I believe it's quite likely that America could suffer the same fate just as quickly. Already, the new president is taking steps that should utterly frighten students of history. He declared, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." It's a famous quote attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte and mimicked by many other authoritarian strongmen, which demonstrates that he considers himself above the law. He's fired the national archivist, who's responsible for administering the electoral college process, the constitutional amendment process, maintaining all federal records, and who oversees the functioning of the Freedom of Information Act, allowing citizens essential insight into government operations. And she was replaced with a loyalist. The president fired the Federal Election Commission chair to hire someone who he could more easily control, and who would not insist, based on solid evidence, that the existing election system was as secure as it has ever been. Gives him the ability to make it easier to rig future elections. He's illegally fired 17 inspectors general, who oversee over a dozen federal agencies. Essentially, all the watchdogs who ensure accountability in government are all now loyalists. He's instituted loyalty pledges required of those who manage the three-letter agencies and any White House jobs. He signed an executive order creating a, quote, new category of federal employees. Top officials could classify positions as having a confidential policy-determining, policy-making, or policy-advocating character. Then they could sweep employees holding those positions into a new Schedule F, where employees would lose all protections, including those against discrimination, forced reassignments and relocations, and any rights to organize or appeal personnel decisions, for example. Most important, employees could be dismissed for any reason whatsoever. End quote. The White House official Twitter feed shared an image of the president wearing a crown with a big smile captioned, "Long live the king." Well, while some of his apologists claim this is merely a joke, an attempt to troll the libs, such imperialist comments by the president and many of his supporters are increasingly common. He's defied courts and numerous federal laws, and in just a month already blatantly violated at least 2 articles of the Constitution and 4 amendments to the Constitution. His minions, led by Elon Musk, an unelected and unaccountable functionary and the richest human on the planet, have taken over nearly every government agency and infiltrated their core business and accounting and personnel systems. His Department of Justice team has directly threatened legal action against anyone who impedes Musk and his minions. He attempted to change the Constitution's definition of who is a citizen. That was blocked by no less than 4 federal judges, but he has not stopped trying to overturn those rulings. He's issued numerous executive orders that assert control over funding, which is a congressional duty and not given to the executive branch. He's purged military academy boards of non-loyalists. He fired several non-male military top brass, replacing one of them with a person legally unqualified for that job. He has excluded one of the largest free press organizations from White House press briefings simply because they refuse to use foolish government map changes. And he and numerous of his leaders have repeatedly threatened the free press with retribution for not supporting his agenda and begun to sue news media who refuse to state his party line. This list is hardly exclusive or complete, and it's not just the president. Many of these actions have been taken by his supporters and proclaimed as right and appropriate by his numerous sycophants. Now, much more could be said about specific actions that have been taken in just 1 month, but to be frank, I'm quite uninterested in documenting them further because it's almost depressing. All of these actions, from my point of view, strike at the heart of a democratic process, where a president recognizes his legal limitations within the American system and willingly submits to accountable oversight. And it completely ignores the idea that the president is a servant of the people, a leader under their authority. Such things have happened around the world many times through history, unfortunately, and it never ends well for the populace. Even those who facilitated the rise of the strongman ultimately suffer, except, initially at least, the ultra-rich who fund the strongman and receive kickbacks as a result. But for all the lowly regular folk, it always ends in pain. And for those supporters who assumed their interest would be honored, the pain is especially intense when they realize they've been betrayed. So, what is my point in sharing all of this? I'll say straight up that I think it's too late to turn this ship around. For one thing, too many changes have already been made, and not successfully challenged by his opponents, to trust that we will have fair elections at a national level in 2026 or 2028. But more importantly, there are simply too many people in America today who give their full-throated endorsement of these changes. Echoing my earlier point, there are a lot of religious people who are quite happy, right now at least, to sacrifice democracy for their ideas about how America should be operated to facilitate their structuring of power and control over those that they perceive as unbelievers and heretics. And by the time they realize their mistake, just like late 1930s Germany, or the advent of any other populist-created dictatorship in history, it'll be entirely too late to walk back the changes. Honestly, it's probably already too late. So, if we can't realistically fix this, why am I recounting these things in such detail? In a word, awareness. And maybe also a second word, preparation. We followers of the way of Jesus, and I'm explicitly avoiding the term Christian here because at present it's too polluted a concept, too tainted by those who support this new regime. We followers of the way of Jesus need to go back and look at Jesus and the epistles' words about their relationship with government. Every single author of the New Testament, and most of the authors of the Hebrew Bible too, were writing from the perspective of people under oppression, subjugated by tyrannical foreigners and whose local leaders were often deeply corrupted puppets of those rulers. Also, we might do well to read some Black history. After all, I write this during Black History Month in 2025, because Black people in America have a lot to teach us about living under oppression and how to stay faithful to the way while resisting evil done against them. And perhaps the biggest change we will need to make, especially for we American middle class and upper class white people who are used to having the government on our side and enforcing our superiority, is to completely surrender our very privileged sense of trusting the government for our welfare and our security. I think the Bible's pretty clear that our trust needs to be directly in God, even when, or especially when, all of our other support structures fail. It's going to be a hard lesson for most of us, myself included, I fear, but it's going to be necessary to survive. And doing a little study of those living under oppression may benefit us. Not just the Bible, but of those in more recent history who have needed to rethink their government and their relationship with their own nation, and to learn anew how to trust God when all hope is lost. None of this is fun. As J.R.R. Tolkien wrote many years ago, but which seems quite relevant today, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." Yes, this truly isn't an easy time, and it would be much less stressful to turn away from those thoughts than to engage them and determine how we're going to live. So, if you made it this far through this episode, I'm deeply grateful for your attention. If you found it useful, please like and share so that others can find it more easily. And I'd love to hear your own thoughts. Drop a comment here, and I'll respond. So, thanks for listening, and be blessed.